partners and colleagues to another session with ShareMark on our governance policies for getting into the digital workplace and the digital workspace. I'll remind all our folks that the world is changing, and it's changing fast. Because of this, there's going to be gaps created. There's going to be winners and losers, folks. You don't want to be left behind. And this ongoing batch of series, we're on almost number 10 right now. We lose track of the number, but they're posted, and we have the cure for sickness. We've got some of the solutions here. So once again, thanks for joining us. You know, after talking through core questions, enterprise decisions, provisioning, governance policies, and security and compliance items that need to be set up, and then even within the last couple weeks talking about CRM, today we're going to talk about enterprise information architecture. We're really going to talk about everything that is within the ecosystem. And Tim and Dave are with you again today, so please, Dave, won't you do some further outlining and begin? And I'll just say to folks that, remember, you can always watch these online, and we'll have some information at the end of the seminar on how you find these seminars on YouTube and other outlets. So with that, Dave, go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning, Tim. Really appreciate being here this morning, and I appreciate folks listening in, and as we talk a little bit about information architecture and what the differences are between an ECRM implementation versus how we set that up so that folks can work with it, as in our content authors, our publishers, our data stewards, people that are contributing files and records and material and conversations that go on as part of a structured and unstructured data, and how we're going to be able to deal with search and messaging and the use of forms. You know, there's a lot to be considered around the architecture in which we look at information as being a component of that. We designed this webinar so that it's a working foundation and a framework for content authors, those that are publishing, a taxonomist, a data steward, and those that participate and interact with all of the documents and files and messaging information as we go forward. Let's not forget that search is a really integral part of our information architecture. Without the ability to improve our findability, we find that our adoption rates fall very quickly, because people need to be able to find the right content at the right time on the right device and any time they need it. We need to make sure that that is possible, and designing our architecture around how that information is processed and proceeded with, we need to make sure that it works on. We provide our clients with working sessions to deal with these, and today we won't be able to get through all of the content in this webinar, but we do have extensive work that we work with clients around 4 to 6 weeks and 2-hour blocks of time every week, and we work through that. And in today's webinar, we're really working against some of the actual presentation information, but we won't get through the 108 slides of information that we generally get through in a 4 to 6 week period of time.
Yeah, there's really a big foundation of stuff here, Dave, with over 100 slides, so that's a great point. Can you remind our colleagues and listeners what the ECRM is, please?
You bet. Enterprise Content and Records Management. That includes not only the inclusion of files, data, content, but it's how we handle it going from a file to a record, and how we work with the disposition and disposal of that document. That makes a big difference in how it moves forward. So again, Tim, thank you. That was a perfect segue in moving forward with where we are. I certainly agree with you that the world's changing, and it's changing quickly. We need to be able to work together to uncover and implement a modern digital workplace solution, and that's what we'll be talking about a little bit today. Any questions or anything that you want to add to the conversation that kind of things that we want to make sure we're addressing and that we're moving forward with?
Dave, it's so clear that this foundation is well thought through. We've got clients who can attest to that. We have the luxury of having been there and done this so many times. We kind of forget about how important adoption is. So I want to remind you of that when you're going through your talk. The things that this practice or this process or this exercise puts in place to assure adoption, and I know you'll smatter that through the talk today, but that is of paramount importance.
Well said, Tim, and I agree with you 100%. You know, one of the things that we need to look at is not only the use of SharePoint, as we would have here, is how it's going to be used in the organization, but now as we're moving towards Teams, we're moving towards the use of files and documentation within Teams, we will leverage SharePoint as part of our Office 365 environment. But let's remember that our governance is defined for inclusions in the enterprise as a whole, both our technical and our processes, procedures, and guidelines. But it includes, as we've spoken to originally here, is around ECRM. And what are our strategic processes? Are we a Sarbanes-Oxley controlled environment, or are we meeting federal regulations in a medical industry? These things can be applied and they can be leveraged in order to be able to make it as useful. And as you said, Tim, the adoption rates are most important to us as we go forward. Let's take a quick review of a little bit about the governance system. This governance is meant to apply both for SharePoint governance and for all of Office 365 ecosystem, and that it runs smoothly and that we improve that. And again, I just wanted to emphasize that we're listening to our customers. We're listening to the business. We know that from a standpoint, oftentimes IT will have a direct influence and could be a direct anchor in how this is deployed, but we need to be listening to our business partners as we're going forward. We won't cover too much of the governance area here today, but I want to give just a quick review of some of the highlights that we've talked about over the period of time in which we've had these. The most important statement, I think, is the top one. Governance that excludes any area is an incomplete governance. We need to have a comprehensive, complete view and how it applies across the environment, because as Office 365 is deployed, it becomes a tier 1 application for the business. And there are many, many instances where we need to make sure that we are applying the proper tier 1 compliance and tier 1 security to the files and records that we go forward with. We want to make sure that we look at all of the people, the policies, the procedures, the processes, the guidelines, what is already in place. And we need to leverage that as we build out a governance plan. We need to understand what the KPIs are. We need to understand that in order to achieve our ultimate goal of 100% adoption, we need to make sure that we know what we're measuring and how we're going to do that so we can obtain the most desired result. Again, adoption is our ultimate KPI. We want folks not only to be aware, but we want them to adopt it into their modern digital workplace. The higher adoption rates are often with craft-specific policies, and SharePoint being the foundation or the platform in which we are looking at. We want to make sure we have really clear understanding of how that is used as well as it is applied going forward. Again, the digital workplace, we won't cover this too much, but it really covers the modern digital workplace, and we establish or we reference many of the materials. Individual groups, as we look through the creation of a new site or the creation of a new app, and we deploy a new app, we want to make sure that we've managed it correctly. And individual and group responsibilities not only include the equipment, how information is stored, what are those locations, be it AWS or be it Azure. We want to make sure that we are operating in a good environment that's a trusted environment. We're using the right applications at the right time in the right place on the right device, and using them availability to us as well, anywhere. Navigation, again, we spoke earlier in a webinar about the user interface, the customer interface, and especially the employee interface. We talk about call centers and help centers. We want to make sure that we follow the guidelines of our help center or our help desk so they can find and use information and how we work with it. It's not just driven by what is out of the box canned. We want to make sure that we apply our proper usage experience. And any custom development down the road that as we talk about, we want to make sure it's well documented and that it is well adopted by our users. Real high in the governance, we want to talk about the governance pyramid. It basically indicates that the broader the scope of the content, the higher the visibility, the more governance is applied. And as we get across through a broad scope, we apply less governance, and we allow and empower our people to be able to do things. And how do we do that? We want to make sure that we set up the right organization to oversee and identify what needs to work in our governance model. So we look at a top-down approach. We have an executive sponsor. They may or may not have a specific board, as in the OCIO board, which then drives and communicates with an executive business steering committee, which may be part of the larger organization. It drives it down into the technical steering team, which indicates information back up the chain. But then we also look at local. And local, I'm meaning that it could be geolocation. It may be that you are a global company and that you need to identify very specific rules, policies, guidelines that apply to your country or apply to your geolocation specifically. And then, of course, as we deploy this, there's a project leadership team that's involved as well. Any questions or comment, Tim? I know in your project management, does this fit within what you would be looking for?
Absolutely, Dave. And if you go back a couple of slides, I saw equipment and storage, and since we're implementing a technology here like SharePoint and all of its brother and sister applications, this is solely an IT process, right? Hey, you can see where I'm leading you, Dave, because the fact is that it's quite the opposite is quite true. This is highly regulated and necessary from a business perspective. Will you elaborate on that?
You bet. What we often find is that when a CIO comes into the organization and says, hey, we're going to implement Office 365, and he turns to his IT team and says, hey, technically, how do we set this up and how do we manage this? And we know from past experience that, yes, we can turn the lights on, we can make sure that the light is bright, and that folks are able to use the product as a whole and the many tools within the suite of Office 365. But what we find is they often forget to go out and talk to the business and say, hey, we're talking about change management now. We want you to be able to change how you manage your information within your environment. We want to show you some neat, new, cool, shiny ways of doing this. And business goes, well, wait a minute. I'm satisfied with what I have. I'm doing just fine. Why do you want me to change? And sometimes we find that that's a sudden step back and a communication gap. We need to make sure the business is engaged from the get-go. We want to make sure that they are aware and they have understood the new capabilities that they would be embracing. Without that component to it, IT's work, and hard work as it is lost, because your adoption again is slow and it creeps forward only because you may have some early adopters in the business who are excited about the new environment and the capabilities, but overall you're losing your capabilities. Does that help answer the question, Tim?
Yeah, well said. It was a statement as much as a question, Dave, but well said. Hey, the world's changing. It's changing fast. You don't want to be left behind. And when you're doing this, think policy. You're not thinking really, how this works, but why you're using it too. That's the big point. Think policy and business on this. Thanks, Dave.
Absolutely. And again, and the reason for Horton here is that we need to hear and understand. And again, we need to understand, what is the business doing? How are they using it? What are they using it for? And how are they applying their documentation in the environment? How is it handled today? What types of disposition or disposal processes are already engaged? What information architecture rules have been set up within the organization for security and compliance, and for identifying different levels of documentation, whether it can be shared or if it's strictly confidential. We want to make sure that we understand how documents are created, reviewed, approved, publication, and then how they are dispositioned and ultimately disposed of. So if we don't listen to what's happening here, we oftentimes lose that. There are many features within the Office information architecture that we need to make sure that not only from a technical standpoint that we have enabled, but what we want to set the guardrails and the borders for the application and use and retaining of documents, and how long are we going to retain that. Not only this fits right within or dovetails in within the ECRM application, but this really sets the parameters for security and compliance and how these documents are used in the environment, day-to-day operations. Remember now, we need to include in our Microsoft Office 365 modern digital ecosystem, we need to include things that are used in Teams, Yammer, Skype for Business, Outlook, Word. We just aren't talking about Word documents or Excel workbooks. We're talking about the entire suite of applications, and it generates not only files and records ultimately, but it's the structured and unstructured data that we need to be particularly aware of, and that really goes
Dave,
forward.
don't forget Planner, Teams, Stream. I mean, it goes on, right?
Excellent.
These systems and the applications come along for the ride. Hey, you might as well leverage them.
You bet. And on top of leveraging them, let's find things that we can reuse and then we can apply standards to. And so, Tim, that's a very good point. Thank you. One of the things that we talked about in ECRM is analyzing document usage, and this is part of our information architecture. We want to make sure that we understand what the typical ownership areas and taxonomy established around content. We want to plan for how this information is going to be used. We want to understand, is it asset production? Are we doing videos? Are we doing a Skype for Business meeting content? We want to make sure that we understand what our copy policies are, what our paste policies are, what restrictions can we put in place. That's what we talked about with guidelines and borders and the guardrails in order to do that. Who's going to maintain this information? Who's going to monitor how this information is managed? How oftentimes do we have quality assurance for periodic auditing and needing of looking at the live content as well as the content at rest? We want to make sure that we apply some type of KPIs and analytics to determine, is our policy actually working? Are people doing the best work that they possibly can do, and are we empowering them to do that? So we want to prepare for an audit. We may do our own internal audits to make sure that we have content that is applicable, that we are maintaining and cleansing or scrubbing the data that's not in there, and we're working through it. So very important that we understand in our architecture not only how we strategically place it, how we plan to use it, how we create the data in the first place, how do we maintain it and prepare for an audit. So part of our document management process needs to go through about 8 different steps. We need to make sure that we're looking at this from a very open-eyed environment and that we are very aware of what's going on. So we need to identify document management roles. Do we have a data steward? Do we have a taxonomist? Do we have someone who oversees all of information management? These are things that we need to identify as clear stakeholders, and what is the best team. And again, that's depending on the size of our organization and the type of content. If we're a DoD contractor, we have certain rules and regulations, and that requires roles and responsibilities to do that. How are we analyzing document usage? Again, this is part of our KPIs around adoption. How are we identifying the users of this information then? Do they have the right empowerment to be able to author it or publicize it or to be able to exchange it? How are we using OneDrive for Business? How are we deploying Teams and the way that works against, when and how do we use Yammer? When and how do we use Planner versus Project Online? When do we use CRM, Dynamics, in the environment? So one of the biggest things, again, and I talk a lot about this, is the structured and unstructured document libraries. Unstructured data could be your Skype for Business SMS or Yammer conversations that are threaded, or even Teams chat where it's a threaded conversation within a particular channel and how that information is used, or a channel that's been provided in Stream, and that channel, is it being used appropriately? Is it going into the right documents, and do I have quick access, and can I search that? How do we plan to move content between locations? How do we share across large geo locations so that information can be shared and used, and allows us to standardize some of that? And we have really good documentation in our planned document libraries to help with this as well, and that's part of our value in working with you. Plan for the flow of content. Do I want it to be able to search is very, very important. When I search for a particular document, do I want that information to be exposed to all content owners, and or do I want that restricted to very specific audiences? I can control that, but I need to plan for it. I need to set the architecture in place so that it's automatic and I'm not having to go back and manually say I want to apply audience targeting. Am I going to use a drop-off library so someone can just drop off a document and business rules will apply across all the organization? And again, number 5 is plan content types. Are you dealing with very large graphics? Are you dealing with video? Are you dealing with audio files? Are you dealing with records that may be stored and archived? What are the things that you're going to do with this data, and what metadata can I apply? And then when I do search for it, for those content types, I want to be able not only to search what's active, I want to be able to search at information that is at rest and that's inactive but stored in a location that has an audit trail, so I can move forward with that. Any questions or thoughts on those 5 topics?
No questions, Dave, but I will contend that in number 5 there, planning content types and things, is because an incomplete governance is sometimes just as poor as no governance at all. I just want to reaffirm to everybody that the audience that we're targeting here includes so much more than IT to really get to the root of these types of requirements, that it's just paramount to have business involved with it as well.
You bet. Well said, Tim, and I certainly agree with you there. I think it's oftentimes overlooked. I don't think it's intentional, but oftentimes we're moving so fast and with such velocity that we oftentimes will forget a little bit about that. Let's talk a little bit about number 6 and number 7 and number 8. The plan workflows. If we're putting in documentation around publishing, for example, we want to make sure that maybe we have a 3-step publishing process, and that when something needs to be published, before it gets put up into the actual application, as in SharePoint or Teams or wherever, we want to make sure that it gets approved. And if there's an approval process, we want to make sure those workflows are installed. And if we're using third-party workflow applications, they work, as in Nintex and some of the other great workflow products that are out there, or using out-of-the-box or even SharePoint Designer workflows that are complex and that we work with them. We want to make sure that our content is put into document libraries that are not using folders, and I know that kind of grates against a lot of common thought, but the way that SharePoint or the Teams or any of the Office 365 products, we want to move towards more of a metadata-based categorization of data, so that we can search and find and organize that information as quickly as we possibly can, either by a forced load into a library, or through an automated process that actually looks at the document and says, oh, I see words in here that identify this as a confidential document, therefore it needs to go in a more secure location. Want to make sure that versioning is turned on, which is an automatic feature as we share into SharePoint. Are we archiving data? How many versions, again, of documents are we keeping? 25, 50, 100? It's capable of our parameter, whatever we set. Again, content approval doesn't need to go through a workflow. One of the most powerful tools within SharePoint alone in itself, in the Office 365, is the ability to assure that we're checking in and checking out documents. This allows us to avoid the email confusion and plugging up people's email boxes, and then allows us to make sure that when we check it in that we add a comment, or that maybe we now tag it with some new metadata. Very, very important that we work with that, and oftentimes this becomes one of the most powerful ways of doing things, but it also is one of the most difficult to use at times. We find folks having difficulty with that, but we want to make sure we expose that and improve that capability. We want to make sure that we have plan policies that are documented and that are publicized and are adopted by the institutional and legal requirements. We want to make sure that we are fitting the needs for a potential audit. We want to make sure that we are dealing with document retention policies. How long do we keep that? Are there certain documents that are infinity, or are there documents that can be destroyed in 30 days? One of the really nice features of using documentation within SharePoint is it can generate barcodes. And barcodes can quickly allow search to be able to search the type of document it is, the quality of the document, and it's an automatic thing. It's something that not a lot of people know about, but that particular function is built into Office 365 on all content going forward. So kind of fun stuff to play with. Again, let me emphasize that, who is our Office 365? Who is it? What are the kinds of documents that we create before we move forward? What roles the documents have? Who reviews the document? Who edits? Who uses the documents? Who designs it? If it's a video design tool, how's it moved across the environment? What are the guidelines? What is information architecture telling us that we need to be able to do? And then who manages those? And oftentimes this is something that a good information manager in a corporate environment spends a lot of time identifying cleanup and scrubbing of data. And who's going to maintain those? Now, servers could be on-prem if we're using a hybrid environment, or are we doing a virtual environment with Azure or AWS or other environments like Rackspace that we might be able to work with those documents? Because one of the biggest constraints within our Office 365 is where storage will fill up quickly. We need to either identify it in OneDrive for Business, which is much more liberal in its ability to store data, and then SharePoint does have its restrictions and provides borders. And so we need to identify where that data is being stored and who maintains it. Who's going to who's going to check? When it goes to OneDrive for Business, yes, it's company and corporate information, but it's more on the personal level, and we need to make sure folks are aware of that. It's a comprehensive design. It's not something that we just move forward through. So one of the topics that we look at going forward in information architecture is, again, what's the topology of the information that is being stored? Do we want to store it by department? Do we want to store it by geolocation, and then break it down into those areas in human resources or legal or IT that stores their particular type of information, and how many engagement libraries do we actually need so that we can maintain that and observe how those are being used? Again, this all comes down into information policies that apply to sites, and sites not only is SharePoint, but it's all the applications that we use within the organization. How that data is stored. Not a lot of people are aware until they really dig into the administrative side of Yammer. The Yammer content and those conversations are not stored locally or within your Office 365 tenant. They're stored on a Yammer server at Microsoft, and you need to request that data. Well, that's part of your information management and your architecture understanding is, what are my ways of getting at that data? What are the policies that are being applied, and how secure? Because I want to make sure that the corporation is providing a trusted environment where we can have those conversations and deal with business policies and procedures. Any questions or concerns around that? Thoughts?
No, you did a good job of reemphasizing my keyword today, and that's policy, Dave.
You bet.
Involve the business and make this a decision, right? Decide to do this under a governing policy. Thanks for that elaboration, Dave.
Oh, no, I think that's a very good point. Thank you, Tim. The information that it collects must include the document type. This is part of our architecture, and it feeds right into our ECRM strategy. If we're dealing with things such as employee performance reviews, internal memos, and product specifications, we need to make sure that we identify that as confidential. Is that something that is very private? We don't want it popping up in a search environment. Documents give, if we get customer recommendations, that we deal with that supporting data as well. What is it? How did we work with it? What product does it relate to? Or what method or policy does it relate to? Want to make sure that we have the author is identified, the date modified, date created, any additional data that we might want to put on that, rather than just a specific, as we often find that is set up, is just a, for example, an IBM user. Well, that really doesn't tell you who owned that document, who wrote that document. We want to make sure that we can go back to a source. So when we apply things like financial analyst or product manager, we want to make sure that we use very defined ways of doing it. We want to make sure that we look at the document type. And again, that comes around to audience targeting. Is it for customers or specific team members, as in the channels that are provided within Teams? Or is this a private or public SharePoint, or not SharePoint, but a Skype for Business conversation? We want to make sure we apply the rules in our architecture. Who's the technical reviewer? Who's a copy editor? And we really get into large medical environments. This becomes very important because these the PII information becomes very, very specific to who should be looking at it and when they look at it. The other part of information architecture that is most important is where is this being stored? Is it on a client computer? Is it off in a cloud web server? Or is it local on a hybrid environment and keeping it on a file server as a company confidential, or a company very high level private levels of information? Where is it being kept? How is this information architecture, and how do we get to it when we need to get to it? Very important. If we're talking with SharePoint, we're talking a lot about the common document libraries. They're collections of files. They haven't become records yet. They are collections of files and content, structured or unstructured, and how those are delivered through a document library. Are they put on as a file folder, which is still SharePoint, in Teams? And how do we manage that going forward? We should plan to forge ahead with document libraries as much as possible across multiple sites and multiple apps. So we plan the flow of content. We want to make sure that our search engine is optimized and that we are looking at the term store within our search capabilities and our optimization around how the data is tagged, as well as it's categorized, so that we can get to it much quicker. Again, this kind of follows into the use of storage locations and how we store that information in. ECRM says, yes, we have this kind of content. We're gonna deal with it in this manner, but we need to know what those storage locations look like. We need to make sure that either it's on-site, off-site, is it virtual, are we using Azure or AWS, and where are these locations going to be, so we can optimize our search capabilities going forward. One of the biggest things is that we need to determine a library type. We need to make sure that content flows to the proper thing. As I mentioned before, we can initiate a document drop-off library where a particular team or a channel can come in and drop off a document within, and it reads that document and says, oh, I see keywords or metadata that has been applied when this document was put up into my document library for the scope. So that I understand, oh, this one needs to go with IT, or this one needs to go somewhere else. And we want to make sure that we go forward on that. It's very, very important. We want to make sure that we provide structures of information that allows us to be able to track and keep that information going forward. Here are the types that we look at, especially in SharePoint. We look at a team site. What is the purpose of a library? Collaboration. We know that's very important. We want to make sure that we set that up in our information architecture, that we know that we're going to set up libraries. Maybe we're pre-populating certain kinds of documents in a team library for project team sites, and that we are easily keeping that control over that and that versioning. A library in a portal area, maybe we want to roll up documents or specific documents within a project library so that it becomes more of a portal where information can be found and stored and worked with. Maybe we put our dashboards into a particular library. A library is a document center. Again, document center is very, very important in how we identify our knowledge base. So maybe we're providing a document center suite for our help desk where information can be published that is useful in their knowledge search and their knowledge base. Really helps with keeping a deep hierarchy when we're using very specialized, as in web parts. How do we use a record center? Record center is where files, content, data becomes a record. And this is where we start to work with disposition and disposal of documents. This is very important for our legal compliance process. It sets up an opportunity for us to have a digital vault, and it allows us to be prepared for audits and moving forward with different things. And it can be meant as read-only, or if we need to pull something out of the record center, there's an audit trail that actually says, oh, this document was pulled out of archive and reestablished as an active document. It'll track all that for us. It does all those great things within our information architecture that sets it up. Perhaps we want to share information with our external sites. We want to make sure that we can either set up a site that our public partners, much as we used to call an extranet. We want to provide a way for them to collaborate and for them to work with us, both from an intranet point of view and an extranet point of view. And so we can set up libraries that we can have certain documents published out to an extranet site so that we're sharing and collaborating. One of the biggest ones that many companies now are turning to, because they're learning and understanding how Office 365 suite works, is the ability to build an intranet environment to where that information is provided to the corporate and how they're using that. And again, how do we mix the two? It's called hybrid, and how we mix these two things together going forward. Here's some examples of how we want to analyze data going forward. Before I get started there, any questions or comments?
Yeah, that previous slide, I never had such a clue that libraries existed in so many different spots. You know, the underlying theme and technology, of course, is SharePoint. But that was an amazing slide, that previous one, Dave. Thanks for aligning that. It's just those things that really need to be thought of, because there's such a tremendous amount of customization that can be done.
Absolutely.
To suit your needs, and that. So thanks for sharing that, Dave.
And that's very important, Tim. Your point is very, very well taken in that. This is a ecosystem. This is not just Office 365. We need to help our customer, our business customer, especially our folks they're dealing with us on a day-to-day basis, understand that they have an ecosystem that they can work with and how they can move forward in dealing with that. Let me give you some examples. Here's an example of a university delivers content to key end users on a market research. The content is created by the staff, the faculty, students who operate remotely. We want to be able to know that a business director evaluates engagement ideas and requests for proposals, workflows. This gives them an opportunity to respond. I know, in a workflow that's very simple, out of the box, is one that says, oh, workflow, once I put it up in the document library, now the business director gets an email that says, oh, you're now to respond. Are you going to reject it? Are you going to approve it? Or are you going to ask for more information? That's a real basic 3-step workflow, but man, what a great way for collaboration and for automating the process of requesting for proposals that a business director might be asking. You know, after the contract is established, a staff member consults and collaborates in engagement-specific working on a particular site, and it's recorded within that. So here again, here's the use of Teams and the ability to set up a channel for a particular engagement. The beauty in that, when the contract is awarded or the contract is continuing to be worked through, it's in a secure environment. And people that need to know and that set that information, we can set that security at any point in time. So when it's closed, but it still is read-only if you need to. Best practices around document is encouraged, and that collaboration. One of the really great things in using Office 365 is it always have the ability to use the web tools for Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., is that you can collaborate in real time. You can have up to many people as you want working on a particular document, and you can see as you work through that process. It's a very powerful collaboration tool, and knowing how that information is collected and organized, and you're applying best practices. And you can, during a collaborative environment where you're writing a document together, you can text each other and say, hey, let's think about it this way, or I like your statement, great job, let's continue that conversation. Those are the things that make the ecosystem so powerful, and is oftentimes overlooked. Is there's ways of looking at things together and collaborating and working together. University record keeping is oftentimes one of the most difficult things that goes on. And here, if we can keep it in a single source of truth, we're collaborating and operating in the same environment, we can really maintain that value for an organization. So this is just an example of one of the uses of a university system. Now here's a real simple RACI. It's just organized in a little different manner. But when we look at information, we want to make sure that, what are the ideas and requests? What is our purpose, our author, who's supposed to author it, who's going to be our end users, and what type of format. So this sets up the architecture of how we're going to work together, so that we're not putting information in locations that are difficult to understand. And there's so many different ways that we can use and manage content within Office 365, but setting the parameters about who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed about that. What are the retention policies as we apply that? So this is just a real quick table about some of the things that you could do and how you work with your information architecture. Document usage, really important as we talk about this. Who's going to use it? Who's the end user? Who are the audiences that are involved? And making sure that we talk with, where are these located? We could even have a hybrid environment. We could still have a SharePoint Server 2013 out there that we have archived information on, or even what we consider is still in the cleanup process. We need to make sure that we have access to that. So we need to know where those are, if we need to move them, if we need to migrate them, and how are we going to use it. And this becomes complex in our information architecture because, in a large utility organization, there were often times where we discovered information back in SharePoint 2010 that was still active and being used, but nobody knew about it until search uncovered it and brought it back to us. So our information architecture not only is our current environment, but it may be legacy environments as well. And we need to make sure we have access to that, and that we apply things like Record Center to maintain corporate records appropriately, and that we migrate that information. And what we had in a previous conversation around ETTL, we need to extract that data, we need to transform it, we need to transition it to the new environment, and we need to load it in the new environment in the appropriate place. And if we don't have a good information architecture understanding of where the landing pad is for that data being moved from legacy environments, we'll have problems with that. Any comments or concerns, Tim?
No, none here, Dave. I always have to come off mute and things. Just good information. And it's interesting how you delve this to, just by the person's role. I mean, we see lawyers and all the different spots here, but until you start asking these questions, people forget all those different roles that team members are playing. So thanks for that elaboration.
Well, and I think that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about what are the different environments that we look at. When we look about deliverable libraries, where are they going to be? Are we going to do extranet, authoring and access to the enterprise? Are we including our business partners in collaboration on documents? I know one of the large government agencies that deals with putting out bids for construction for streets and roads or sewers and water lines. They want to make sure that the documents are out there for the contracting companies to bid on, and then they put their information into their location, and that they have that ability. But we also look at the internet for doing things like that, project planning libraries, project specific libraries that are locked down within specific audiences. And then where's a general document library where I want to go and get an RFP template and how to respond appropriately to a HUD RFP that comes out. And then how do we deal with that within our intranet? And how are we securing that documentation? How do we lock it down or lock it out of the extranet or the intranet? And how do we make it so that once we have a closing date on a RFP that we can shut it off? Again, information architecture just talks about generalized information moving forward. I'm going to skip this one. We've talked a little bit about it, how we move it and stage it between one site to another. And an author has the ability to copy a document, and how do we allow them to move that from one location to another? There's very, very simple ways and very complex ways, but the really great thing is that, especially in Teams and in SharePoint, is that everything that is done is logged. So we have a complete history log of all documents as they're moved. You know, we can refer back to our security and compliance issues, and how did we find out that Edward Snowden, our infamous global tenant admin, was able to move documents? We looked at the history logs. We looked at the audit trail, because every time a document is moved to a thumb drive, for example, or to an external hard drive, that is tracked, and we know exactly how it was moved. Until that was discovered, Mr. Snowden pulled hundreds of thousands of documents out of SharePoint, and that's exactly how he did it. But the beauty is that good old SharePoint, it's tracking everything that we do. Again, talking a little bit about the information architecture, where things moved from and to, how are things copied, where is workflow applied, and how is it applied. Publishing features are very, very important as part of our capability, because it invokes a workflow. The copy command, and how do we move that data from one location to the other? You know, you can actually go into SharePoint and tell it to go to another SharePoint library right within the ellipse. So there's lots of capabilities. Send to command in the enterprise records repository. You can send it directly, and that can be automated. You know, learning how to integrate content types and workflows. The work session that we go take folks through really talks about this, and it talks about content type, reusable collection of metadata, columns, workflow, behavior, are all really important to how we go forward with all of this. So this is where we're going to stop here today. If there are any questions or concerns, please let us know, and we're glad to address it. Is there any further conversation?
Hey, Dave, thanks again. The world's changing. It's changing fast. You don't want to be in that gap that's left behind. These are the cure for that ailment. Don't be left behind. These will be posted and shared. Contact us with any additional information. Remember, team and partners, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we have 108 slides in this very section that we use in our governance, you know, in tackling and describing governance in our deck. So please contact us and our partners for further elaboration. With that, Dave, maybe you can splash up our contact page. I don't know if you have it at the end or the beginning, but with that, do you have any closing comments, Dave?
I really don't have it today. It's just a pleasure to have the opportunity to present this information, and it's very, very useful in how we we move forward, and we look forward to an opportunity to work with clients and help them from the beginning to really understand what it is that they're trying to do and how they're doing it. So thanks again, and we'll just give her a good handshake and a hats off to all of you for listening in and being participatory. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dave.
You bet.